excited to introduce this next guest. We spent a lot of time trying to help campaign for him when he was running for Senate here in Texas. So everyone, please put your hands together and welcome Beto O'Rourke.
All right, hi everyone. I'm Shawn Hauser. I'm a partner at Vicente Cederberg LLP. We're a national law firm focused exclusively on cannabis law and policy. I'm thrilled to be here today to talk with my colleague Jerrico and with Beto about cannabis reform, specifically in Texas. I was born and raised in Austin and was pre-med at the University of Texas when I became impassioned about cannabis as medicine and criminal justice reform, and shifted gears and moved to Colorado in 2008 to attend law school and work on changing cannabis laws, which really started here in Colorado and then progressed in the rest of the country. So I've been working in cannabis reform for about 12 years, and in addition to practicing in Colorado, working with cannabis businesses and shaping policy, we've been working to reform Texas laws and maintaining a practice in Texas. And I'm thrilled to be here today along with my colleague Jericho here.
Hi everyone, I'm Jericho Perez. Also an attorney here in Colorado at Vicente Cederberg LLP. I was actually born and raised about an hour west of Lubbock, Texas, a little town called Whiteface. Followed a very similar path as my colleague Shawn and went to school at the University of Texas, majored in poli-sci, moved to Colorado to go to law school, and I guess my third year of law school started clerking with Vicente Cederberg. Immediately started working there after passing the bar, and for the past 6 years have been advising clients, cannabis clients on cannabis law, and also engaging in the very important topic of cannabis reform. Thrilled to be doing that in Texas now with my colleague Shawn, and to discuss that today with former Congressman Beto O'Rourke, who's with us. Beto, as you all know, is a 2020 presidential candidate, founder of Powered by the People, and perhaps most importantly, former punk rocker and friend of Willie's. So great to have you with us today, Beto.
Thank you, Jerrico, Shawn. It's good to be with you both.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about legalization, both federally and reform in Texas too. And this is something that you've been passionate about for a while. In 2011, you published your book, Dealing Death and Drugs, The Big Business of Dope in the US and Mexico, An Argument for Ending Prohibition of Marijuana. Again, that was quite a while back, right? Before this was big business. So tell us why you're passionate about this issue and how you got involved with Willie and his team.
Yeah, prior to, say, 2009, this was not something that I was particularly interested in. There were people in my life, including close family members, who used cannabis, and I think used cannabis medicinally. Something that I tried in college, and was part of popular culture and popular culture humor, right? Cheech and Chong, and something that was not central to my life, or I didn't think an important policy issue. Around about 2009, our sister city here in El Paso, Texas, Ciudad Juarez, became the deadliest city in the world, bar none, in large part because of the demand for illegal drugs in the United States, including, at the time, marijuana, and the war on drugs that really comes to a head right here at the US-Mexico border, and had essentially been exported to Mexico and Central America and the rest of the hemisphere. And it had produced such a premium on the ability to cross marijuana into the United States, where it was readily available here, that people in Juarez were willing to kill or die for the ability to cross this drug, because the profit margin on it had just, increased exponentially. So knowing that marijuana was a cornerstone of the cartel economy, back in the early 2000s, we started to explore why that is and what it would take to remove profits from the cartels and the kingpins and so many of these transnational criminals, and also understand better the cost and consequence of cannabis prohibition in the US, especially for communities of color and the mass incarceration that we see all across the country, but nowhere more so than we do in Texas, which has the largest incarcerated population in the country. And our country already has the largest incarcerated population in the world. From all of that came this idea for my colleague on the city council, Susie Bird, and I to write this book, Dealing Death and Drugs, and to understand the history of marijuana prohibition in this country and what the future might hold for ending the prohibition and legalizing it in America. One of the things that we found, Jerrico, Shawn, was that one of the first cities, if not the first cities in the United States to outlaw marijuana was El Paso, Texas. And it did so not on any scientific or medical grounds, but really did so in really an effort to stoke anxiety and fear about Mexican nationals, Mexican Americans, and Mexican immigrants to the United States. This idea that Mexicans who used marijuana would become murderous and criminal and become a threat to white Americans in El Paso and in Texas was used by the city council to pass a law prohibiting marijuana. And that trend continued throughout the Mountain West. Cities like New Orleans and New York with a high concentration of immigrants and African Americans, and really became a proxy to criminalize non-white Americans in their own country. In fact, by the time it is prohibited federally in the 1930s, one of the only groups speaking out against its prohibition is the American Medical Association, because there's no medicinal or scientific foundation for the prohibition. So that book kind of charts the history and then talks about what we might be able to see in the future if we took a more responsible, a saner, common sense approach to marijuana.
So interesting. Yeah, not a lot has changed, it sounds like, Shawn.
Yeah, no, not a lot has changed, but it feels like it's time, to change things. Like you said, the war on drugs doesn't work and was admittedly intended to incarcerate minorities. Your book discusses why the only real alternative is to responsibly regulate marijuana. Can you explain why that's the solution, regulation?
Yeah, I mean, it would be hard to argue that we could devise a more harmful, pernicious policy than the one that exists in many states still to this day in 2021, including in Texas, where you can be stopped and frisked and arrested and incarcerated, and then upon release, forced to check a box on every employment application saying that you have a felony or conviction for the sole crime of possessing a plant that is legal in more than half the states in this country and throughout much of the rest of the world. That's what's happening right now. And you might like to think that our prohibitionary policies are in place for the most noble of intentions, keeping people safe or averting them from, if you believe in the gateway theory that marijuana would be a gateway drug to much harder and perhaps more deadlier substances. But my conclusion, Shawn, is that you have our drug laws and the war on drugs in large part to attempt to control African Americans, Mexican Americans, people of color in this country. And it's something that I've really begun to understand watching Ava DuVernay's extraordinary documentary on the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery with the exception of those who are in forced labor resulting from a criminal conviction, and the history of convict leasing in the United States, particularly in the South and especially in Texas, where county sheriffs were able at will to arrest Black men and Black boys for so-called crimes like loitering or jaywalking, or being rude to a white person on the sidewalk, to allow those sheriffs to arrest them, lease them out to private companies and public corporations to be able to do the kind of work that African Americans were forced to do when many of them were enslaved prior to the end of the Civil War. And many of the reasons that so many refer to our war on drugs as the new Jim Crow is because it's put a number of new crimes on the books following the prohibition of marijuana and so many of our other drug laws that have allowed police once again to stop and arrest Black men and Black boys by and large, but also women of color and many others as well. But that's the primary target. And to make it that much harder for them to succeed in life and have equal opportunity economically, educationally, or otherwise. So ending that really bad policy and replacing it with something that's much better, that acknowledges, as you've made the case, that there are really important medicinal properties to cannabis and marijuana that a range of Americans would like to use. Many are using, some having to do so illegally. I met a woman in Waco, Texas, who told me she has fibromyalgia and it's incredibly painful for her. Everything she's been prescribed doesn't work or makes her just feel sleepy or out of it. And the one thing that makes life livable for her is being able to use cannabis. But in the eyes of the law in Texas, that makes her a criminal. And she asks, why is this? Or the veterans that I've worked with who come back from Afghanistan or Iraq or Vietnam before that with traumatic brain injury or post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, their doctors at the VA want to be able to prescribe marijuana instead of an opioid, knowing that they're more likely to become addicted to an opioid and perhaps even die from that addiction. But under the law, they can't do that. So changing the law to help those who could use the benefit of access to medicinal cannabis, and frankly, changing the law to allow those who want to use it recreationally, in posing no harm or danger to their neighbors, to themselves, to our communities at large. This is just common sense policy. And when you look at what we would save from the over-policing of our communities and the costs of incarceration and the cost borne by society when someone can't get a job because they're checking that box on every employment application form. When you look at the wrongs that we could right, given who is disproportionately arrested and imprisoned and affected by the war on drugs, namely African Americans and communities of color in this country. And when you look at the proceeds, the tax revenue that our communities, our counties, our states, our country would be able to enjoy, it's hard to make the argument that we shouldn't do this. In fact, the only argument to keep things the same way is because that's the way that they've always been. And that happens to be about the worst logic that I can think of for supporting any policy. So that's the case against our current policies in a state like Texas and for better policies going forward.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense.
No, I absolutely agree. And, our firm actually estimated in a recent economic analysis that Texas would earn $1 billion in tax revenue per biennium with a regulated market where, people would have access to cannabis that was manufactured pursuant to safety and quality controlled standards and labeled, and people work hard. How should we be spending that $1 billion?
There are so many ways. I would probably start with addressing the fact that we are the least insured state in the country, meaning more people in Texas go without the ability to see a doctor or take their child to a therapist or fill a prescription than in any other state in the country. And the result of that, Shawn, is that you have people in Texas dying of diabetes, dying of the flu, dying of curable cancers, because they literally cannot afford to get the help that is there in the richest, most powerful, most medically advanced country in the world, but for the lack of political will and resources to fund that healthcare that so many Texans desperately need. That would be a great place to start. Expand Medicaid, or go beyond that and insure every single Texan so that we're all well enough and healthy enough to do whatever God placed us on the planet to do in the first place. You might also look at weatherizing the electricity grid and our energy supply in the state of Texas, probably something that Jerrico from West Texas knows something about. But in the winter storm that we saw here in February and the resulting man-made power outage because we failed to invest in weatherizing our electricity grid and connecting with the rest of the the electricity grid in the country. More than 200 people died in Texas, and they died from hypothermia and exposure. They died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Little kids died in their beds, literally freezing to death because we could not keep the power on. Imagine using just a fraction of that $1 billion to weatherize the grid so that the power is always on, and then maybe go a step further and make sure that kid is sleeping in a house that is itself weatherized and protected from the elements. There are so many people in Texas who could use the help. And it's not a matter of charity, and it's not just doing the right thing morally, although that's certainly true. It's also allowing them to live to their full potential. Imagine what that kid would have been able to do in his life. Having the proceeds from the tax revenues generated by legalizing marijuana in Texas allows us to fund these priorities and literally save the lives of our fellow Texans in the process.
Right. Yeah, and I think everybody can agree that that's something we all want to do. You talked a little bit about the drug war earlier, and I know you were a councilman in El Paso. That's where you're from. We did want to ask you, you having been from there, you were on the front lines of the drug war. What do you see as the biggest cost and consequences of that? And as a follow-up, how can we cure those harms? Talking about policy, we just talked about the tax dollars and where you'd like to see that go. But let's talk a little bit about the legacy of harms we've seen from Prohibition and how could legalization cure those?
Yeah, I think perhaps the greatest harm that we've done is to further racial injustice in this country. Just today, we learned that a young Black man was killed by police officers in North Carolina. We got more of the evidence surrounding this case. I think 7 officers came to serve a warrant on a drug arrest charge. Now, without knowing all the details about that charge and still awaiting the body cam footage of the killing and potentially the murder of this young man, and maybe most likely the murder of this young man, given what we know about officer-involved shootings against unarmed Black men and Black boys and Black women in this country. This is obviously part of a much larger pattern, and in effect is a result of a system that many would argue, myself included, is working as intended. Some folks will say the system's broken. How could this happen? I think the system is working as designed. In other words, the criminal justice system and the largest prison population on the face of the planet, one disproportionately comprised of brown and Black Americans, this is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And the harm is not just in the life and the lives lost. The harm is not just those who lose years of their lives behind bars and their lives unalterably changed upon release and their options constrained and their choices narrowed as a result of that incarceration and that felony conviction. But it is what it does to us as a country. And it gives the lie to this idea that we are all treated equally under the law with equal opportunity going forward. And when young people in this country no longer believe that they have an equal shot or any opportunity in the future, I think that begins to spell the end of America, and at least this idea of America, that we really are all created equal, all be treated equally, and we'll all have equal opportunity in this country. It also harms so many people in so many other countries. I mean, why is it that so many tens of thousands of children are leaving Central America and Mexico to come to this country? In part, it is because of the drug trade, the illegal drug trade that has hollowed out civil society in these countries. In part, it is the war on drugs that we have pushed upon these countries, militarizing their police forces and absolutely corrupting their judiciary and all the institutions that you might want to depend on there. So there's really no protection or recourse to the law for so many who live there, compounded by other things like climate change and these awful droughts and storms that are produced by man-made climate change. then you understand that we have helped to produce a lot of suffering and harm in these other countries that is now literally coming to knock on our front door at the Texas-Mexico border, where so many of these asylum seekers are arriving right now. So beyond, our rights, our freedoms, our civil liberties, and our personal privacy when it comes to the war on drugs, and particularly the prohibition of cannabis, we are doing foundational harm to this country and to other countries and to our fellow Americans at this moment. And I think it's really incumbent upon us, now that we know the facts and the truth and the history and the consequence, to change course while we still can. And the great news is, thanks to you all and to Willie Nelson and his family and so many others who've been doing this work for so long, this country's attitudes around cannabis are changing, and maybe changing far more quickly than many people thought. More than half the states have at some level legalized this. But as you all know all too well, because of the work that you are doing in Texas, for which we're grateful, our state, the state that I'm in right now here in El Paso, Texas, has some of the most regressive, oppressive, racist drug laws on the book when you look at the outcomes and who is disproportionately affected. So our work is not done, and we have a lot of change before us still to make, but we're in good company. The fight is on. There's some legislative opportunities right now in this biennial session in Texas. They don't go far enough. Even if passed and signed into law, they won't get us there, but they're steps in the right direction. And this whole fight, this whole struggle has been about the accumulated steps in the right direction. And it's been going on now for decades. It's now upon us to see it through to the end.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And you were talking about some of the harms the drug war has done and how legalization might cure those. I think a big part of what we do in, pushing responsible cannabis policy is ensuring social equity in the industry, right? And trying to right those harms that we just discussed. What do you see as a responsible social equity policy for cannabis? I mean, beyond just decriminalizing, is there other work to be done through cannabis legalization, whether it be expungement or incentives for minorities to enter the industry? Can you discuss that some?
Reinvesting into some of these communities that were disproportionately impacted,
Yeah,
especially in Texas.
Yeah, Jerrico, Shawn, I think that's absolutely the right track. And you all are the experts in this, and so you should guide me. But from what I have seen and what I've read about, this idea that we can focus on a more restorative justice. In other words, it is simply not enough to legalize cannabis and in its regulation of the sale and distribution, to just allow all comers to do whatever they please within the marketplace. Given who has been disproportionately harmed by the prohibition on cannabis and marijuana, namely communities of color and primarily Black and brown Americans, I think it's incumbent upon this country not only to release all those who are incarcerated and imprisoned for nonviolent drug offenses, especially for marijuana. Not only is it enough to expunge their records, but I think we have to follow models that we are seeing pioneered in some states and some American cities. Like I visited a cannabis dispensary in Oakland, California. And I believe, if I remember correctly, the dispensary owner was at one time arrested and incarcerated for selling cannabis on the black market before it was legal in California. And that arrest and that time in prison and that conviction might have very well ended any meaningful legal economic opportunities for him, or certainly made those opportunities, far narrower and the choices far more constrained. Instead, through, I think, a very just, progressive policy, that community prioritized his application and made sure that the very person who was most harmed by those policies in that neighborhood was the same one who could legally own and operate a dispensary hire those in the community who could benefit from the jobs, and ultimately profit from his ability to work within a legal marketplace. Now, I don't know if that's the perfect model. You might have a better example, but it sure seems to be on the right track. And I think there's a really necessary, healthy debate taking place in this country about who is profiting right now from the legalization of cannabis in those states that have a legal marketplace, and whether there isn't something more that we should be doing going forward. So I think that's the right path. But actually, if I could, I'd love to get your take on this. You all understand the industry far better than I do. What are the best examples that you are seeing right now across the country?
A big part of my work is actually national licensing across the U.S., trying to get businesses and individuals into the cannabis industry, get them licensed to own these businesses. And we've seen a lot of examples of very well-intended laws be passed and regulations be passed that are really trying to solve this social equity issue and prioritize involvement in the industry from these communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the drug war. I don't know that I have seen the ideal regulatory scheme yet. We just saw Illinois play out, where the program's been stalled so long that none of the social equity applicants that actually applied are going to get licenses, and they're not able to afford their leases, the property. Investors are pulling out because it's been a 2-year-long process. So I don't know that we've seen an ideal program be implemented yet. I think we're seeing it in California starting to play out. Denver actually is starting to roll out their social equity program, and we've had cannabis here in Colorado for a very, very long time. And we've had some great policy people on that. Minorities, the Minority Cannabis Business Association has been very involved. So I think that in the next year or two, we're going to have great examples. I don't know that we're there yet as well intended as we might be.
Yeah, I think as you said, the debates that are happening on the federal and state level to not just have the best intention, but to actually be able to implement a program that actually has the impact on, taking care of these communities that have been disproportionately impacted. How that's actually works in practice is very difficult. Even though many of these programs are well intended, but I would say the importance of expungement can't be overstated. As you said,
Definitely.
A conviction will follow you for life. It may, prohibit you from getting a job. It's going to put you in this system that, makes you more likely to get in trouble again. It's going to hinder your ability to, support your family. It's just really a life sentence that, is imposed on minorities at rates significantly higher than white people, and expunging records, which needs to be done on the state level and at the federal level, I think is critically important, as well as providing support for minorities to participate in the business other than licensing preference by providing no interest or low interest loans and education program and training so that they can have the opportunity to participate in the same way that others do. And those discussions are being had on the federal and state level, and I think in a meaningful way. And one thing that's frustrating about Texas is we can't even get to that discussion yet. We're so far behind. We still are leaving most of our patients behind. Our program only services a little over 2,000 patients, which is nothing in the state of Texas. So, I'm hoping that Texas is ready to have that conversation because, as you said, it's particularly situated as disproportionately impacting certain communities.
Yeah, and Shawn, I think Shawn made a good point about education and awareness, right? If we're going to do expungement, unfortunately, we can't just, as you know, push a button and it's everybody with a record, it's erased. So education and awareness and getting those communities of color involved and making them aware of these opportunities. Shawn mentioned the medical program we have in Texas, and a lot of people don't even know we have a medical cannabis program in Texas. How would you suggest people get involved? How do we get the Hispanic community in Texas involved and made aware of this and start actually getting them to be a part of the process?
Yeah, I don't know that there's a better way to do that outside of direct engagement. And by that, I mean, and I know it's tough because we're coming out of this pandemic and not everyone is fully vaccinated yet, but, God willing, and thanks to President Biden and his extraordinary effort, we might soon be there, maybe as early as this summer. But when we are, I think it's really important that we are talking to people and talking to voters in particular, because obviously they're the ones who decide the outcomes of the elections that control, who is going to be in that state legislative seat or on that city council dais or representing that congressional district in the U.S. Congress. Talking to them about this issue and listening to them about this issue. What are your hopes? What are your concerns? What's missing from current policy, not just in Texas, because it's a long list of what's missing in Texas, but what's missing from some of these debates that you were just characterizing around restorative justice and equity and making sure that those most harmed by the war on drugs stand to gain once the war on drugs is finally ended, even in this state of Texas. My belief is that when people have that kind of personal engagement and ownership in the answers to those questions, when this is not, a talking point or something that's just being debated by representatives in the state legislature, but it's something that we're talking about around the kitchen table. We're talking about with our neighbors. We're going to town hall meetings and listening to the discussions or even the debates around this. I think a subject that has been frankly forbidden in common political discourse in Texas, with some few exceptions, becomes commonplace enough that you really begin to develop the solutions that may be unique to Texas. And I can only imagine what it would mean for this country and for the conversation when it comes to cannabis, for Texas to take the step of legalizing or decriminalizing, or medicinalizing, or in some way taking a more rational approach to cannabis. I think that would really mark the end of the state-by-state process, and I hope usher in the era of a true national federal policy and response. And I know there's no perfect analogy, but the way that this country finally threw up its hands at the end of the prohibition of alcohol and said, look, for all of the noble intentions, the cure was much worse than any of the symptoms or the underlying disease. And we are losing out on tax revenue. We're emboldening criminal organizations. We're seeing so many people die unnecessarily, and all because we won't allow them to have a drink or a pint of beer or a glass of wine. And the country came to its senses, and ultimately there was a federal response to that. I really feel like that's what's needed and what's missing at this moment. I hope it doesn't take waiting for Texas, because I don't know how long we'll be waiting, but it might very well. And if that's the case, then our work's cut out for us. And it can't just involve waiting for those in positions of public trust and power to come to their senses and do the right thing. I don't know how long that will take. It's really on us to tell them, or to replace them if they're not listening, that we need this policy, and we need it for a host of reasons that range from, the medicinal, which is so important. I've heard that firsthand across the 254 counties of Texas. And as you all know, because you know Texas and Jerrico, especially, rural West Texas, this is not a conversation that I only hear in Austin or Houston or San Antonio or Dallas. This is a conversation I hear in Plainview, in Dalhart, in Pampa, in Longview, in Palestine. I hear it all over the state, and I hear it not just from Democrats and not just from young people. I hear it from the most conservative Republican you could imagine, who's just glowing red. I hear it from rural cattle ranchers and cotton growers. I hear it from everyone. The people of Texas are there. That to me is clear. We now are waiting for the politicians in Texas to catch up. And my hope is that if they don't catch up soon enough, that we replace them with people who get this and then get it done.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I feel like that's the case. And, it's so frustrating in Texas for the census that came out yesterday. We're the most politically powerful state. We have, I think, some of the best medical infrastructure in the country. And, we have one of the most limited medical programs in the country. And there are nearly 1 million Texans who suffer from a serious medical issue that could benefit from medical cannabis and can't access it in Texas, but could get it in other states. And they've been at the Capitol year after year, these patients, veterans, their parents, their doctors, their caregivers, talking to leadership about how medical cannabis has saved their lives, has saved the lives of their kids. And it's been session after session. And, what I'm seeing this year is people are getting disheartened and discouraged in the fight. And it feels like no one is listening, and it feels like nothing's going to change. And we might as well just wait for the feds. And, how do we keep people encouraged to stay in the fight here in Texas, especially when, I think the attitudes are changing and education's changing, and, we're moving the ball down the field a little bit. How do we get people to still get motivated to, go tell their story?
Yeah, I think we take some heart from what we're seeing happen in other states around the country. And none of those victories were easy. And you all probably know that better than I do. You may have been involved in them, and you certainly have been watching them. But it took this kind of concerted effort on the part of citizens of every walk of life, and, rural, urban, Republican, Democrat, not allowing any of those divides to keep us apart in pursuit of this common goal. And that's just how you get it done. And it just turns out that Texas is going to be a little bit harder and maybe take a little bit longer because it's a little bit bigger than any of those other states. And when you add to that the challenge of voter suppression, and we keep talking about Black and brown Texans and communities of color, these are the people in this state who are the targets of voter suppression. And so that means so often their votes are not counted because they're never cast in the first place. Their voices are unheard. Their seats are not filled at the table when we're having the policy discussion. 7 million Texans who were either registered or age eligible to vote did not cast a ballot in 2020. 7 million in the most important election in our lifetimes weren't at the polls. And there are probably a number of reasons for that, but primary among them is the fact that this state is the hardest state in the union in which to vote. We are 50th of 50. There's no online voter registration. There's 750 polling place closures just in the last 8 years. And those polling place closures are concentrated in the fastest growing Black and brown neighborhoods in the state of Texas. The most onerous voter ID laws in the country. You can use your license to carry a firearm to prove who you are at the polling place. You cannot use your student ID at the University of Texas at Austin to prove who you are at the polling place. You have a racial gerrymander of the state. They literally broke the congressional districts down along racial lines and moved those lines to essentially dispossess Black and brown voters of the political power to affect elections. That's what we're up against. And so it's no wonder when you know that we're dead last in the country when it comes to the rate of insured, that we have some of the lowest levels of teacher pay in the country, and teachers are routinely working second and third jobs to make ends meet in this state. It's no wonder that we're on the front lines of climate change, whether it was the winter storm in February or Hurricane Harvey before that, or other man-made climate disasters in between. It's no wonder that you have 50,000 dead of COVID. And it's not just anybody who's dying of COVID in Texas. It's communities like mine in El Paso that's 85% Mexican American. It's Native American communities. It's African American communities. It's all of these people who are affected disproportionately by these really bad policies, including the war on drugs and our policies around cannabis, who are the same ones who are targeted for voter suppression, who are not showing up at the polling place and voting. and ensuring that they're represented in these discussions and in the policies that follow. And so, it's tied to stopping bad voter suppression bills that are pending in the state legislature. It's tied to supporting good voting rights bills that are pending in the U.S. Senate, like the For the People Act, which would allow for same-day and automatic voter registration, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which would reintroduce pre-clearance so that Texas and other states of the former Confederacy couldn't pull these voter suppression tactics off unchecked. All of that is part of the mix. And so I want those who are watching not from Texas to know that the reason that we have not made progress is not for any lack of will on the part of the people of Texas. It's not for lack of popularity when it comes to this issue. It is a really bad set of circumstances in the biggest state of the lower 48 by landmass, second biggest by population. It's really tough to get this change here, but doesn't mean that we stop. Doesn't mean that we don't continue to try to move forward. It just means that we're honest with ourselves about what kind of effort it is going to take, what kind of help that we want from those not in Texas who want to support the effort here in Texas, and then just how fundamentally important elections are. And the next big round is in 2022, and obviously the presidential in 2024. So we have our work cut out for us, but I really believe that Texans are up to the challenge, and that ultimately we will see this through. It's just taken a little bit longer than we'd otherwise want it to be.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It sounds like what you're saying is this really isn't a partisan issue. And I think we're starting to see that across the U.S. South Dakota, Montana, Mississippi. We've seen these programs pass in the last year or so in all of those states, Alabama coming close. So what is it then? I mean, you said you've heard conservatives talk about this and glowing red Republicans, and they're on board. But what does it take to really get them on board? How do you go about having that conversation with them and getting this done in Texas?
Again, I think it's showing up in those communities and showing up at those front doors and having those conversations directly with people, and then having an action that they can take following that. Now, that may be supporting a pro-cannabis candidate. It might be supporting a local ballot initiative. And, there have been various attempts in different Texas cities to essentially deprioritize the criminalization of cannabis by their local police. But having something that people can do is incredibly important. And my hope is that in 2022, we really have a strong understanding of where our state representative, state senate, U.S. congressional, gubernatorial, lieutenant gubernatorial, attorney general, and other candidates are on this issue and on the related issues. And we brought up a number of them, whether it's criminal justice and economic equity, or whether it's the conjoined issues of voting rights that disproportionately affect some of the populations in Texas that have been so harmed by the war on drugs. So I think that's what it's going to take. And the tough thing, Jerrico, is that it's not easy. It's not a matter of spending money, right? Like it's not about running TV ads or Facebook ads or sending slick mailers to their houses. It's about people showing up and having these conversations, and even better, if it's people that they trust who are members of their family or neighbors of theirs in their own community, who say, look, this is something that I've been thinking about lately. And when I look at what Texas spends to lock people up for the sole crime of possessing a plant that's legal in most of this country, when I look at the lost tax revenue that we could be using to ensure that people can see a doctor, or that our teachers are paid enough not to work a second job. When I think about just how unjust these policies are, I want to change this, and I want to have this conversation with you and see if you feel the same way. And if you don't, I want to hear you out and see where we might find some common ground to be able to move forward. I think that's how this happens over time in Texas. It sure helps if you're focused around an election or a campaign or an outcome that everybody can work towards. And one of the challenges in Texas, as you probably know, is we don't have popular ballot initiatives. And so citizens can't start, for example, a ballot initiative to decriminalize or legalize marijuana or cannabis in Texas. That has to originate in the state legislature. And so then it makes our task a little more complicated, but it forces us to say, all right, we're going to look at a list of everyone, Republican and Democrat and independent alike, who's running to represent us in the state capitol, to find out where they are on this issue and whether they're willing to make a pledge to either pass legislation that would do this or at least bring it to us, the voters in the state of Texas, which after this census count that was just released this week, we now know totals just under 30 million people, that the people of this state should be able to decide the outcome of this issue. That's what I think we need. And so I certainly, for one, and we'll talk about this with our volunteers empowered by people, I'd love for us to be part of that effort of knocking on people's doors and talking to them about this and a host of other really important issues that affect their lives, and then see if we cannot form the popular will to help those state reps form the political backbone to do the right thing. And I hope we do it in a way that doesn't distinguish between Democrat and Republican, and just looks at us all as Texans, as Americans, as human beings who have this extraordinarily unique opportunity to do the right thing. And so let's see if we can't get that done. We have a lot of time before November of 2020.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think especially with, how things are progressing federally and in other states and Mexico and New Mexico, there's a lot of momentum around this issue and a lot more people educated and engaged. And, one of the challenges this session in Texas is obviously it's, we're able to make hopefully incremental progress, but it's very difficult to engage the current leadership on this issue. And do you think there's particular message that the current leadership or Republicans in general are most receptive to? Is it the $1 billion in tax revenue? Is it states' rights? I mean, where should we be focusing the session on, as you said, working with people who think differently than we do, to find common ground to do something better than what we've got now?
Yeah, I think listen to people and find what moves them. I mean, for me, it's the moral imperative. I mean, how can we be locking people up? How can we be arresting people? How can we be using these drug laws to incite fear within a given community, and to give police the opportunity or responsibility to threaten the use of force against people who are unarmed and have committed no crime other than having this plant in their pocket that is legal in so much of the rest of the world, and certainly in the majority of this country. But that may not move you, and it may be the economic imperative. How the hell could you lose out on this $1 billion biannually that could help to plug some gaps in our finances in Texas, or allow us to underwrite some of the programs that we've never had the resources to pursue? Or maybe it is the opportunity cost. I mean, we're spending so much money building prisons and locking people up, and what if those resources were freed for something else? So I think there's so many lines of approach. And then we talked briefly about this earlier, but just, I mean, you know better than I do, again, how many people could be helped from a medicinal perspective in Texas. And I, from my service on the Veterans Affairs Committee for 6 years in Congress, really think I have a good understanding of how it could help veterans. I remember at a town hall that I hosted in El Paso, this young man, and it just about broke my heart and broke the hearts of everyone in the room. He came up to the microphone and talked about having come back from his service overseas in battle, putting his life on the line for this country, and being treated for his injury that he sustained in service to America by opioids that were prescribed by a doctor at the VA, opioids to which he became addicted. And after the VA cut off his prescription, he told all of us in this room that he was buying heroin now on the street. Now that guy is not a criminal, at least not in my eyes. And really, he's a hero, and even more so for having the courage to come forward publicly and to admit this in front of everyone and say that he needs help. But for me, it begged the question, how much better off would he have been if his doctor at the VA had been allowed to prescribe him cannabis, to which he would not become addicted, which might have far more positive therapeutic value for him in treating the injuries he sustained in service to this country. How many more people like him are there across this country? And how many have we lost in a country where the rate of suicide of U.S. service members, veterans, is more than 20 a day every single day, and all of whom right now are federally precluded from receiving that treatment at the VA? That's just veterans. But it's hard for me to think of a more important population in America. But think about those with glaucoma, or those with cancers, or those who are receiving end-of-life treatment, or those for whom this is a helpful part of their therapy. I just think that there are so many people in our lives, again, coming back to these conversations, if we were just to ask, the folks around us, our coworkers, our colleagues, our classmates, our neighbors, our parents, our grandparents, to tell us their story. And I bet you we'd be surprised. I remember when I was running for Congress in 2012, and I was getting a lot of flack for having written a book right before I ran for Congress calling for the legalization of marijuana. And I remember this guy asked if he could come visit with me. And he said, Beto, when you announced for Congress and I learned about your position on marijuana, I just thought you were the stupidest guy I'd ever heard of. One, it just politically suicide for you to take that position. Two, as a healthcare professional, he was a pharmacist. I just could not believe that you were advocating for the use of an illegal drug. And that about sealed the deal for me. But then he told me this. He said that his wife's mother, who had incurable cancer, was suffering at the end of her life. And as a pharmacist, he knew that she was being prescribed every manner of drugs that essentially produced this cocktail that was just turning her into a zombie. And she wasn't able to sleep. She wasn't able to eat. She wasn't able to function. She wasn't able to be with her family in any kind of meaningful way. And then he told me that unbeknownst to him, one of her other children got her some marijuana, and she used it, and it completely opened her up, regained her appetite, was able to sleep, was able to communicate with her family. And her final days were so much better than they would have been otherwise. And not just for her, but for the rest of her family. And so this guy says to me, like, look, I've gone from somebody who thought you were the biggest idiot on the planet to someone who now I think understands where you're coming from. But it took me, he told me, seeing what my mother-in-law went through and what our family gained from her ability to use cannabis for me to finally understand that. I mean, the more of those stories we learn and then share, the more comfortable people feel in telling them, I think the better our chances are going to become, and the better policy outcomes we're going to find in Texas. So maybe that's something that we could all work on together.
Yeah, I think we've all heard so many of those stories and heard of people totally flipping once it becomes personal to them and for the people that they love. So I agree, those conversations are essential to the reform we're trying to see. We're getting close on time here. I did want to ask you, you mentioned we need a national solution, right? So can you explain why you think it's important for federal legislation to end the war on drugs and not just leaving it up to the states, not cannabis reform, not just being a state by state issue, and then, when you think that might happen on the federal level?
I mean, the reason it can't be a state by state issue, or shouldn't be a state by state issue, is why in the world could someone in your state, in Colorado, be able to legally purchase and use cannabis, and then that same person in my state here in Texas be arrested and incarcerated and their life changed forever for the same thing? You just have to have a consistent national policy. And maybe there was some virtue in allowing or ensuring that the different states could experiment with different ways of rolling out these policies or different ways of addressing the harms done to communities of color throughout the war on drugs, and different ways of exploring how to ensure that equity is addressed as you introduce marijuana into a legal marketplace. But now it's time for us to move to a national standard, and at a minimum to end the national prohibition on marijuana. I saw the other day on April 20th, 420, the Senate Majority Leader tweet out something about ending the federal prohibition of marijuana, and doing it on 420 and kind of making a 420 joke. It seems so tame right now to do that. I mean, it's no great leap on his part, and I'm grateful that he did it. But imagine that waking up and seeing that in your news feed 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It's absolutely unimaginable. So we are so close that when the party in power in the White House, in the House of Representatives, in the US Senate believes that this is the right thing to do, maybe momentarily stymied by the filibuster and maybe still lacking full political will to get this done. But it's evidence that we are so close right now. And I really believe it's only a matter of time. But the urgency for me, and maybe for you, and certainly for others, is that every minute delayed before we get to that solution is another arrest, another person behind bars, another life ended in a police shooting or a drug bust gone wrong, another kid killed on the streets of Juarez by a cartel because he's still trying to move something through that plaza that's legal in most of the United States, but still illegal in the city of El Paso and in the state of Texas. So while I think it's inevitable that we'll get there, we cannot get there soon enough. And I really hope that we continue to ratchet up the urgency and the pressure on those who represent us at the state level and at the federal level as well.
No, I completely agree. And it seems like there's, the time is now. I mean, it's too late, but the time is now, and that there's perhaps a little bit of history repeating, that there's lessons to be learned from the repeal of alcohol prohibition and the Great Depression, and the repeal of cannabis prohibition potentially after this once in a century pandemic, and for Texas after the energy crisis. And we've got to take care of our people, and we just can't have a world like we have in Texas where we're criminalizing a veteran for accessing what's the most safe and effective medicine for them. So it seems to me there's a little bit of history repeating and some important timing to pay attention to now. That's right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I hope everyone feels as inspired as we do after this. Before we close, is there anything else you'd like to say, Beto?
I'm just grateful, Shawn, Jerrico, to the Luck Festival, to Annie and Willie Nelson, and everyone who's part of this incredibly important work, for what you have done so far, what you've accomplished, and what you're working on going forward. I mentioned that we need more urgency the closer we get, because who's going to be the last person arrested in the state of Texas for possessing cannabis? Who's going to be the last person incarcerated? Who's going to be the last person to lose their life absolutely unnecessarily? Let's make sure that we get there sooner than later. So I just encourage you to keep up the great work, and for everyone who's watching, to pitch in whatever way you can. Financially, certainly that's helpful, but also having these conversations with your friends and family, especially here in Texas, and make sure that we get people talking about this incredibly important issue, so that we make this incredibly important change here in this state and in our country. So I'm just very grateful to you, very honored that you asked me to join you. And I just encourage you to keep up the great work. And Jerrico and Shawn, it's been great to talk with you and to get to know you, and come back to Texas as soon as you can and help us get this done.
Absolutely. We'll be working hard.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for your time and your wisdom here. I think it's exactly the education and empowerment people need. And, for everyone listening, there's, I think, 33 days left in the legislative session and a number of important cannabis bills that are moving forward. So there is urgency. It's right now, and I would encourage everyone to really get engaged here.
Yeah. Thanks for the conversation. It's been great. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Adios. Be well.
Bye.
You too.
Bye-bye.